From 1932 until 1933, the Nazis were the largest political party in the Reichstag. Normally, the leader of the largest party would be invited to become chancellor, but no one liked or would work with Hitler. Also, President Hindenburg, who was responsible for appointing a chancellor, didn't like Hitler. So for months, there were many backroom deals as different politicians tried to formulate a workable government. The question for today's video is, how, despite all these people who disliked Hitler, did Hitler become chancellor in 1933? There are 3 essential questions that you need to be able to answer by the end of this video. The first, who are Heinrich Bruning, Franz von Papen, and General Kurt von Schliecher, and briefly describe their role in Hitler's rise to chancellorship. The second, what is the basic narrative of the Backstairs Intrigue? And the third, what were the effects of Hitler's rise to chancellorship? So we're going to start off with a brief review of what we've learned up to now. If you remember, at the beginning of our Weimar Germany unit, we learned that Weimar Germany was based on proportional representation. So nobody had majority of seats in parliament and no strong governments could be formed. There were always coalition governments. Then the Depression happened, and the chancellor at the time was Chancellor Bruning, one of the guys from the Essential Questions, so listen carefully. He was part of the Catholic Centre Party, and his strategy for dealing with the Depression was to raise taxes, cut wages, and reduce unemployment benefits. Well, as you can imagine, these policies fractured the coalition government. Basically, everything fell apart because the Social Democratic Party withdrew from the coalition that Chancellor Bruning had made. As a result, Chancellor Bruning needed to rely on Article 48 to pass any laws. And ultimately, the German people were unhappy and beginning to turn to more extreme left and right-wing parties like the Communist Party on the left and the National Socialists on the right to solve Germany's problems. So before we get into today's topic, there are some key people you need to know. The first is President Hindenburg, the second, Franz von Papen, and the third, General Kurt von Schliecher. So President Hindenburg was a former army leader. I know that we've spoken about him before. He hates Hitler, as I aforementioned, and he was advised by wealthy conservative businessmen and the army. He was also an older gentleman, which will play a little bit of a role in the future. Franz von Papen was a member of the Catholic Centre Party, just like Chancellor Bruning was. He was a rich Catholic nobleman, Hindenburg's friend, and he distrusted Hitler. And finally, we have General Kurt von Schliecher. Apparently, he was not tied to any one particular party, but he was heavily involved in politics. He was a former army leader. He was Hindenburg's main advisor from about 1925. And at the start, he supported Franz von Papen. However, as we shall see, that changed in 1933. Furthermore, he also distrusted Hitler. Before we move on any further, it might be wise to pause the video and look back to your notes on the structure of the Weimar government, because this is going to be a key thing to remember for the next little while. So let's move on to the Backstairs Intrigue. This is the moment that Hitler had been waiting for. If you look at this timeline, you can see that it goes from about June or July of 1932 and ends in January 30th of 1933. So, in June of 1932, Chancellor Bruning was sacked by Hindenburg because nobody was happy with what he was doing. His policies on improving the economy were making people unhappy. In July of 1932, new Reichstag elections were held. The Nazis won 37.5% of the vote, and this made them the largest party in the Reichstag. However, you'll note that 37.5% meant that still less than half of the German population was supporting the Nazis. And, even though they're the largest party in the Reichstag, Hitler was not appointed as Chancellor. Instead, Hindenburg appointed von Papen, because they were friends, and von Papen thought that he could get a coalition government of right-wing political parties together. Von Papen had virtually no support in the Reichstag, so his goal was to create this coalition government with the Nazi Party. But Hitler would have none of this. He would not support von Papen as Chancellor, and a lot of tension was caused. As a result, in November of 1932, another election was called. At this election, the Nazis' support went down, and they won only 33.1% of the vote. However, this still made them the largest party in the Reichstag. But again, Hindenburg wouldn't appoint Hitler as Chancellor. And at this time, General von Schliecher stopped supporting von Papen as Chancellor. So what happened was that Hindenburg reluctantly appointed von Schliecher as Chancellor because von Schliecher had convinced a whole bunch of other political parties and people in the Reichstag to stop supporting von Papen. So now von Schliecher was Chancellor. Moving on, a private deal was made. So at this time, von Papen and von Schliecher were in a sort of power struggle. Both of them wanted to be Chancellor, and they both had weak coalition governments. So, on January 4th, 1933, von Papen made a private deal with Hitler. Papen agreed to work with Hitler and allow Hitler to become Chancellor if von Papen could be part of Hitler's cabinet as the Vice-Chancellor. January 22nd, von Papen asked Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, and Hindenburg's response was no. So, on January 28th, von Schliecher, because he was having so much difficulty, he couldn't get any laws passed through, and therefore he couldn't really do anything, von Schliecher resigned. And then 2 days later, Hitler got what he wanted all along. So Hindenburg wanted von Papen to come back as the Chancellor, but he was advised against it. And von Papen convinced Hindenburg that the Nazis would be easy to control because they would be limited in number in the cabinet. A cabinet consists of all of the people who advise the Chancellor, and this convinces Hindenburg. He appointed Hitler, and that's what this photograph is of, the day that Hitler was appointed Chancellor. And von Papen is appointed as Vice-Chancellor. So at the moment, I want you to take a look at the cartoon you see. I want you to identify the people, including those in the background. And think about, what do you think the main message of this political cartoon is? What is it trying to say? Last but not least, we're going to take a look at the effects of Hitler's appointment to the Chancellorship. There are 4 effects that I want to talk about. Number 1, there's an increase in SA membership. In January 1933, there were about 500,000 SA members. 1 year later, there was 3 million. So membership increased incredibly from 500,000 to 3 million. The second thing that happens was that the activities of the SA are legalized, and they were recognized as auxiliary police, like extra police. The third thing was that the SA launched attacks on socialists and communists by taking them as political prisoners and imprisoning them in concentration camps. So we can see that Hitler was starting to act against socialists and communists, his political opponents. And lastly, Hitler demanded another election for March 5th because he had a coalition government, and what Hitler really wanted was a majority government. He wanted the Nazis to have 51% of the Reichstag, so that he could pass any bill that he wanted. And that is how Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. Thanks for watching.